Thank you. I'm trying to start my video. Okay, there, it worked. Thank you, Katherine, and thank you so much for the invitation. I wish I could see you all personally because I would love to say hello to many of you. Unfortunately, maybe we'll do that next year. So a challenge for Senalde and your colleagues. You should do this next year again, and we'll all be in person. That would be terrific. Anyway, yes, this is a challenge to try to comment on all these different presentations. So I think I'm going to maybe skip on commenting on all of them, and I'm going to just want to raise 3 issues. I want to talk about conceptual frameworks, measures, and policy implications, and I'll be very brief. I think on conceptual frameworks, you've all seen the complexity of the topic of social norms influencing women's empowerment. And to that, it's not that social norms are very difficult to define. And we have seen, and I think Anita's presentation is very good in showing all the challenges of definition. But, social norms are one of the determinants of women's empowerment, and there are many others. There are many other contextual factors, there are household factors, there are individual factors, and they all interrelate. And I think that is what adds to the complexity. And one of the challenges I think that we need to do in research on social norms is to try to see how these other intervening variables interact with social norms to produce certain outcomes versus others. And more concretely, I was thinking in terms of Sangeeta's research in Mali, and the question that I asked immediately was, how does polygamy affect the perceptions of mothering? Because polygamy, about 40% of families in Mali are polygamous. And polygamy has very, very different, being a first wife or a second wife or a third wife has very different implications for mothering. So that is an example, I think, that research in social norms should try to start doing. The second one, I think, also was the research by Yue Qing on China, on the education of women and how that sort of leads to assortative mating. Well, what happens in all those provinces in China when you have very imbalanced sex ratios and you have a shortage of women and a shortage of women in marriageable ages? How does that affect the perceptions of women being desirable or men, being less desirable in terms of marriage? I think that has probably has significant implications for the outcomes, and would be something that I would encourage you to do at some point, to look at these different outcomes given different variables. The other thing that I think we need to start doing much more is, yes, social norms affects women's empowerment, but there's also feedback loops, right? And an empowered women have a feedback loop affecting social norms. And I think we want to do that. In terms of measures, I think that the challenge is that we have to start looking much more into, and I think Poonam was saying it as positive deviance inquiry, and I love that. And it's really try to start doing research on how social norms are changing, because it used to be that we had very traditional environments with no change. I think that's not at all the case now. I think that social norms are changing, behavior is changing dramatically, and social norms are changing dramatically. And in terms of policy implications, I think that what we want to try to understand is what are the determinants of changing social norms. So another issue in terms of sorry, my dog came into the room. You don't see him, but he is very cute. Another issue that I think we want to do is, for measuring social norms, I think we want to start separating and measuring social norms in different domains and treating them sort of as very separate categories. In sort of the work on health and family planning should be very different from the work that on economic areas and economic empowerment. And I think that being very partial will help, I think, with putting together the knowledge. So there's another issue in terms of, do we measure at the level of individuals or we measure it at the level of collectives and institutions? Obviously, when we're talking about social norms, I think we want to try to have measures at the level of collectives and communities. And I think that's a challenge for measuring social norms. It's also a challenge for measuring empowerment. We have measured empowerment at the individual level, but I think we have to move to the collective measure. Anyway, so finally, in terms of policy implications, and this is where, you know, as interesting as the research on social norms is, for quite some time, I think, particularly in terms of policy implications, when you talk about social norms, you talk about something that is cultural, that maybe changes or that doesn't change, but that is not so amenable to policy. So, and I think that in particular in some, you know, and it used to be, for instance, at the World Bank, where I used to work, at some point in time, if the outcome was explained, oh, this is a social norm, so therefore we don't have to do anything about it. So I think that while we should continue the research on social norms, and it's very important, but we have to make sure that it's not being used as an excuse for no action. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think you did a great job of connecting the dots across the presentations. I'm conscious of time, and I definitely want to make sure that we do get to questions and engagement with the questions that the audience raised. So I'm just going to limit my points to 30 seconds or so, and then I'm going to dive into the first round. So, you know, for me, this was such an interesting webinar to attend, because I've been grappling with this question around norms. How do we change them? Can we change them, for a long time? A few years ago, I was in a meeting with a, you know, very powerful philanthropist who shall go unnamed, where we were talking and trying to sort of really pitch actually new work that was really around sort of gender norm change, etc. And this person said, you know, of course we all want these norms to change, but what can we do to change norms? I mean, in the sense of, you know, policies, interventions, like that's not how norms change. But I think, as Mayra showed and said and indicated, you know, norms are changing all the time. They're changing rapidly. I've seen norms in North America over the last 10 years, 20 years on certain issues, like completely change, you know, at a pace that I couldn't have imagined. So we know that norms are changing, but the pathways and the mechanisms, while they leave their traces behind, are not always transparent to us, often because they're not measured. So our ability to kind of measure and trace and demonstrate that, yes, not only are norms changing, and we see that, but there's also ways that we can intervene and actively shape and shift norms or contribute to that shift. And so I felt very unable to make the case and make the argument in an empirical way, which was what would have been helpful for this particular philanthropist. in part because of the measurement gaps. And so for me, coming into this session and sort of hearing of the advances again across multiple disciplines in terms of trying to make this sometimes invisible pathway, or to unpack and understand how these changes happen, is highly practical, even though it may not seem so on the surface. Because I think it's offering us insights that can certainly move forward our understanding of ourselves and our communities, but also really help inform interventions and policies. And I think starting with Sangeeta's presentation, talking about norms and their relationship to vaccines and vaccination, I mean, could there be a sort of more practical, immediate, powerful connection between sort of some of this research and very practical life or death kinds of questions today? So with that, what I'm going to do is we're going to either have one round or two rounds, and it kind of depends on how concise folks are. But what I thought I would do is in the first round, I'm going to lob to each of our speakers a question. It's probably going to be double-barreled because I liked so many of the questions that came up in the chat. So I'm going to send over a question or two to you to pick up. And then if we have time for a second round, I'm going to ask you to draw a link to another presenter or connection that you saw in what you were speaking to in their presentation. But let's start with round one, and I would maybe ask our speakers to try to limit their comments to a minute or two. So now I'm going to go to Sangeeta first. Lots of questions in the chat for you.